You can see that one. So in case the slides get cut off a bit, there's a slide share link to the slides. They're also at the LinuxFest Northwest schedule if you go into this talk. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, so let's give everybody a minute to get a copy of the slides and we'll get started. Okay, so my name is Drew Levine. I actually lead the documentation team at IX Systems. IX Systems has been a FreeBSD shop for a very long time, and they typically sold servers. About 5 or 6 years ago, we started sponsoring some open source projects. So we started with the PC-BSD project, which is a desktop based on FreeBSD, and then we went into FreeNAS. Being the only documentation person at that time, I was a lucky person that got to write all of the docs as things happened. And I want to talk a bit, a couple of years ago, I migrated all of our docs to Sphinx. So this is what this talk is about. So we're going to talk about whether you're in a commercial setting or in an open source setting, if you have documentation, especially documentation that has grown over time, how do you start to manage all of that? And what tools are out there to help with that? So I'll talk a bit about what some of the problems are when you're dealing with documentation, what are some of the solutions that we used and looked at, and why we decided to go with Sphinx. Being a documentation person, I think a lot in text and also in music. And when I was looking at a documentation tool chain called Sphinx, I thought, wow, Doc Like an Egyptian would be such a cool name for a talk. And then I went and looked at the lyrics to the Walk Like the Egyptian song, and I thought, gee, that really applies to documentation. You start ending up with old stuff, and sands of time sort of starts carrying it away. And I do apologize in advance if you find yourself humming to the Bangles sometime today. So we're going to talk about Sphinx as part of an open source documentation solution. So Sphinx is an open source project. It was actually created by the Python project so they could manage their own documentation. And this is all based on my own experiences. So I'm not trying to sell you on the concept of Sphinx. I'm just saying this is where we were, this is what we looked at, and this is why we decided to go with Sphinx. And while all this stuff is happening from an open source perspective, it could apply to any place that needs software documentation. So a lot of companies are starting to use Sphinx. So as a doc person, so we always hear about coders when they're starting a new project, they have all these grand goals and all the cool things that their software is going to do. And I can tell you that doc people also have all these grand ideas on how documentation should be handled. So as a doc person, if I was living in an ideal world, I would, for every software release, I would have docs that match that release and show you how to use it. And all the screenshots are up to date. It has everything to do with this particular release. I would also, in an ideal world, would want to be able to push those documents out in formats that are useful to the people who are using that software. So that may be HTML on a website, it may be EPUBs or PDFs that they're reading on their readers, it might be man pages, it could be API documentation. It really depends upon who your user base is. Especially when we're dealing with open source, you're dealing with users from all over the world. And you'll often find that a large portion of your user base, English is not their first language. So ideally, we would have translation teams, and for all of our releases, we would have translated documentation. And after all of those goals are met, obviously being an anal doc person, I'm going to want my docs to be grammatically correct and hopefully technically correct as well. So thinking, well, that all sounds really good. It also sounds like a lot of work. Then we get to the reality. What really happens with software documentation? Especially when we're starting to deal with open source projects where you're relying on volunteers and they don't always have access to the developers. So you'll find a lot of open source projects, their docs are incomplete. They may not be versioned, and a lot of the documentation you find is outdated. It worked really well with the version 3 years ago, but we've changed all of those screens since then. And that assumes the documentation even exists in the first place, because unfortunately there's a lot of software out there that is totally undocumented. The other thing that doesn't help is you'll often find in software projects that docs aren't the rock star that code is. So there's still a bit of a mentality that they're not as high a priority as getting that code out the door. There's also still a bit of a cultural idea that nobody really wants to write documentation. And the flip side to that coin is, well, nobody reads the docs anyways, why do we bother? And the real problem is there really is no perfect software out there that's going to make it easy for you to manage your docs and to get all of your doc goals to line up. So that's the reality. If we take a bit of a closer look at some of those points, the reason why there's incomplete and outdated docs is not because doc people suck. It's because software is a moving target. And we're living in an agile world where releases seem to come quicker and quicker. So it's not like where it used to be where it was 18 months to 2 years before you had a different software release. There are some projects that are constantly releasing or releasing every 3 to 6 months. And that's problematic because as an end user, if I want to use your software, having outdated docs is actually worse than having no documentation at all. We've all experienced where you're trying to use new software and you go and you ask the great Google, how do I do this? And you spend 3 hours of your life following a tutorial that no longer has anything to do with reality. And you just don't get those 3 hours back. So if you are responsible for documentation, you're thinking, how do I version my docs so that people know they're reading the correct version of the documentation? How do I keep archives for people that are still using older versions of the software? And how do I make sure that it's easy for people to find the correct version that matches the software they're using so they're not wasting their time? The respect issue. So things aren't as bad as they were, say, 20 years ago. So docs are starting to get a little bit more respect. But there's still a cultural issue where they're not considered to be as important as code, and they're not considered to be as important as QA. And QA is one of those words, it's like, oh, we don't do that in open source. But the three of those, I actually think of them as a triangle. They rely on each other. And part of writing documentation helps the QA, helps the coders. So you get that virtuous cycle. And the other thing, the whole respect thing, especially every open source project is going to have community members who actually volunteer their time to help people on forums and mailing lists and IRC to point them to the right stuff. And sometimes over time, those people get burnt out and we get the whole RTFM thing. But instead, you want to always have, as part of your culture, people really do want to know how to use your software. They're really not stupid, and you just have to show them the right place to get the information they need. And oftentimes when you're doing that, you'll go, oh, there is no place to get the information they need. And then you have to also train your community members. You need to make a bug report for that. Or if you have commit access, why don't you just write that portion of the docs and get it out there for people? You'll notice that under finding the perfect tool, I did the whole double quotes thing because there is no perfect tool. If there was, I would have started using it years ago. And when you're looking for how do I manage my software, there's usually two things that aren't vibing with each other. One is how easy is it to actually format our docs? Because you don't want to have too high of a barrier of entry because you want people to actually contribute to your docs. If you are able to find a language, a formatting language that's easy to mark up, are there editors for that? Is it something that people can get a hold of? And does the tool that you're using support all the formatting that you need? And this is going to vary depending upon the tool, and it also depends upon what you're putting in your docs. So if you need numbered code excerpts, you need a tool that is actually going to make it easy to create those. If you're creating a lot of tables, or if you're captioning your figures, you want a tool that somebody's not going to pull their hair out spending 2 days trying to format a table so it will show up in your docs. And I've actually decided there are two universal laws when it comes to doc tools. So the first one is if you need a lot of different outputs, so we need HTML on our website, we need man pages, we need PDFs. The more outputs that you need, that's going to be inversely proportional to how easy it is to format that. So if you find a tool that makes it really easy to format, guess what? It's going to be available in one format, and that format will suck. The second law of doc tools is the more docs that you need, the fewer number of doc maintainers you're going to have. And that's just sort of a reality. And I can give you a couple of examples of tools that I've seen in production that I've used over the years. And one example is using a doc or an ODT, so say LibreOffice. There's good things to this. Probably the best thing about it is a what you see is what you get editor. So people know how to bold, they know how to italic. Pretty well everybody has some sort of Office editor on their system. So for people who are doing your markup and writing your documentation, it's a really easy tool for them to use. The problem is that collaboration, it's not designed to be a collaborative tool. And you get people that you tell people use this template. Guess what? They won't use that template. The fonts are going to be different. They're not going to bold what they're supposed to be bolding. And if you've ever tried to take a .odt and export it to different outputs and come up with something that you would actually want people to look at, that's painful. Been there, done that. Another example is a wiki, and wikis were really popular about 10 years ago, and every project had a wiki. And again, one of the reasons why was it was a very low barrier to entry. These are designed to be collaborative, so you get that piece. And your formatting language is no harder than learning HTML. So you have a cheat sheet, you tell people this is how you format things, good to go. The problem with a wiki is it's not designed for anything bigger than a 1 or 2 page how-to. It has no concept of a table of contents. It has no idea what content flow is. There's no way to version it. Am I looking at the how-to from version 2.8 or from version 3.0? It has no clue. And if you want to aid yourself quickly, try to take existing wiki content and generate it into a PDF to get that out to your people. And the other thing that everybody found out with wikis is, despite what Kevin Costner says, if you build it, they don't come, and the only people who do come are spam bots. So you end up with some person whose only job it is to get rid of spam wiki pages. Yep.
I have an experience with in-house documentation. That putting stuff up on our wiki pages just prompted our service desk to copy them into PDFs or Word docs, which they then store to another location.
Yes. Yes. And much fun ensues. Yes. Then you get into something more flexible, like latex. I don't know how many people have ever had to fight with latex before. So it's a beautiful, rich formatting language. There is nothing that you can't format with latex. You can generate pretty well any output on the planet, because that's what it's designed for. Rich formatting language, make as many outputs as you want. It's also designed to basically integrate into your build infrastructure. That's what it's designed to do. The problem is high barrier to entry is putting it lightly. Even people who have used latex for years still don't know how to format everything that they need to know how to format. So we're talking a really dedicated time commitment on both of the people that are learning the language and those of you lucky enough to try to teach them the language. So those are examples of how different tools don't necessarily do what you want to do. So I'm going to talk about Sphinx. So obviously I thought it did something interesting, because I actually converted, we have about 5,000 pages worth of docs that I converted over to Sphinx. And there were some things that I was looking for when I was looking at our existing doc infrastructure, what tool can do things for me. So I started looking at Sphinx. So one of the things that Sphinx promises is there are many different types of outputs that you can create. So it's almost similar to latex that way. So I have a whole handful of different outputs, and that's not them all. So basically, any format you need your documentation in, Sphinx is capable of doing it. It also comes with a large number of extensions, which are very useful. My favorite one is the ability to auto-number figures. So when you're dealing with a 500-page document and you decide to make a new chapter 2, it really sucks to have to go in and renumber all your figures. It will actually create figures as they're added. It will shuffle all of the numbers for you, and it also hyperlinks your figures so you can refer to them anywhere in your documentation set, which is very handy. It understands table of contents, and it will actually make it for you, and you can control what the table of contents will look like. It understands indexing and glossaries. So again, there's tags that we can use to index the terms that are important, and it will automatically create the index for you. Sphinx is actually ASCII file. So you're dealing with files that end in an RST extension. It's using the REST language. Because that is text, it's really easy to put your documentation in the same code repository that your code lives. And if you're dealing with different versions of code, you can have different doc branches for all of your code branches. And because it integrates into that, if you already have translations set up into your build infrastructure, you can have that. If you're using CI to test that your builds are working, it also integrates into that. And that was something that was important to us. Because Sphinx comes from the Python project, it does use a conf.py. I had absolutely zero knowledge of Python when I started using Sphinx. I probably now have 1% knowledge of Python, but I know enough of things that I can put in my conf.py to control what my docs look like and what gets spit out by the build system. It also has several built-in builders. So for example, before we do a release, I can say make link check, and all of the thousands of internal and external links, it will double check, and it will write me a report if any of the links are incorrect, which is really handy. That used to take me 2 days of work of very angrily looking up every link in our documentation. It also has several themes built into it and the ability to create your own custom themes. There's actually a whole chapter in the Sphinx documentation on how to make your own theme. And if you have CSS people, you can actually fully customize what things look like. What I found is most people obviously don't have CSS people, because pretty much everybody who's using Sphinx, their documentation looks the same, but you can certainly brand how you want to do things. Other thing that's very useful is you can link anything. I can link figures, I can link keywords, all of my headings, so I can refer to them elsewhere in my documentation. And the last thing about it that's cool is it's text files. So it doesn't matter what OS your writers are using, all they need is their favorite text editor. If they want to test the build, and that depends upon your own processes, they'll need Python installed, but that's not necessary to make changes. Another alternative is to train your writers to make Git pull requests if you're using a Git repository, which is what we do. Now that all sounds great, but it's not the perfect tool. It does have limitations. And some of them were odd when I started using Sphinx. So one of the rules with Sphinx is you can't put two formatting things together on the same line, which means you can't do bold italic. And we had extensive use of bold italic in our documentation. So I had to decide, I can get around this by learning CSS, which isn't going to happen, or I can decide on bold or italic, which is the decision that we made. So it's just a weird, odd things like that that you usually don't see in a formatting language. The other thing is that it does have documentation, and the documentation is pretty good. It does assume that you understand Python, so if you don't, it's not as useful as one would hope. And usage examples don't really exist. It's more like, here's what you can do, here's the knobs, and it's like, okay, how do I write that down in my conf.py? So there's a bit of experimentation on how to do that. I'm hoping that as more projects start to use Sphinx, that especially as if they're, for example, their project is in GitHub, it will be much easier to find useful conf.pys on the net. Because you can say, oh, that's how you did that. I'm going to try that out. So let's give an example of what an ASCII text file looks like. We'll see if this is going to work. There we go. So here's an example from our documentation. So here I've used an index tag. So I'm saying in the index, this goes under the configuration setting. I've set up a linkable heading called control panel, and I've made this as a section 2, or basically header 2 heading. You'll notice I just have regular text. It does understand things like trademark symbols, all of your Unicode symbols. Here I've set up a note, and here is my favorite feature. I'm using the please auto number this picture for me. So this sets it up as linkable, and I say this is the picture to use. This is what it looks like. It sort of got cut off a bit trying to fit into the slide. Here is my automatically generated table of contents. Here I'm section 8. It's called control panel, so that's what the heading looks like. This is how the note was formatted. And here it called it figure 8.1 because it's the first figure in chapter 8, and it put the figure in for me. So fairly easy syntax to get there, and then it generates it. So this is our HTML version. The other thing that's handy, we do have a very active translation community, and I'm going to have the URL for this project at the end of the slides. We use Pootle, and Pootle is nice because the only thing your translator needs is their web browser. So they don't have to download any software. The only thing they have to do is look at the English and type in the translation. So here I have a paragraph in English. I am in the, which translation am I in? I'm in German. So it's showing the paragraph before for context. Here's a paragraph that's currently in English, and the translator writes the German in there. Depending upon how you've set up your pootle and what roles you've given your translators, ours work in teams, so when they do a translation, instead of pushing or publishing, they just say suggest, because we don't publish until a second translation member looks at the translation. But you can actually just have them publish it live. So as we make our changes in English to the documentation, our translators actually get an email of that commit, which tells them, hey, we've changed in Pootle. The new English is automatically uploaded to Pootle. It shows up in their browser. They do the translation. We push that to our HTML servers. So very quick turnaround for that. And that's something that you can all do if you set up your process that way. Couple of handy tips that I learned converting over all of our stuff. So right now I'm responsible for 5 software documentation projects. So I started with one, learned as I went, and liked it so much I went and converted the other 4. So we were using the painful process of LibreOffice and trying to put that into PDF and HTML and lots of cleanup. And it really meant that I got to have the master ODT and everybody had to send me their commits, which was a terrible workflow. So what I did is I said, okay, so I have ODTs, I wonder if I can convert to RST. And if you do a Google search for that, and it doesn't matter what you have right now, if it's PDFs or HTMLs or LaTeX, there are conversion utilities available, and then you just sort of play with them. Having said that, I have never used any type of conversion utility that made a really nice conversion. You're always spending time cleaning up the mess that it makes. So you usually get about 80% of it looking good, and you're cleaning up the rest. But I took it as a learning experience. It's like, oh, this is a tag you used to do bold, or oh, this is how you put in a note, because it did most of that for me. So it was useful to do that. So my suggestion would be is if you have existing documentation, take a small document, run your conversion utility through it, and then go and take a look at what it generates. You're also going to want to take a look at your goals. So are you aiming for version docs? Not every software project has the manpower to be able to do that, or the time. So maybe your philosophy is the latest and the greatest is the only doc that we have, and that's what's up on our web server, for example. So you need to take a look at, what are our goals that way. And also, how do you want to publish? Are you going for HTML for your web server? Are you going for PDFs or EPUBs? Do you actually want to build a help system into your software? Because you can do that as well. That's what we do with FreeNAS. If you have code, you should already have a source repository. And take a look at how your repository is laid out and decide how do we want to fit our docs into that. Do we want to create branches for versions, for example? Do we just want to have a doc branch? And put your source files in there. Yep.
Do you put your documentation source with the code of the application?
So what we've decided, so we do version docs. That's our goal. So as we cut a branch for our software, so for example with FreeNAS, as we go from 9.3 to 9.10, we also make within that branch, we also make a doc subdirectory.
Okay, so you don't have separate repositories for documentation.
Correct. But that was our way of doing it because that was how our build infrastructure went. So it's up to you. You could have a separate doc branch because it really depends on how you're laid out now and what it is that you're trying to publish. So it really depends upon your build infrastructure. But it's very flexible. It doesn't care. You can put it wherever you want. Once you do figure out where to put your REST files, you're going to want to create a README. and it should have instructions, so people can grab your REST files, how to make edits, and how to submit those edits. And that README should also include a cheat sheet. So every project is going to be different. You're going to want to format different things, and you'll often have a certain style. So you may want to bold a term the first time that it's used, for example. So this is something that belongs in your cheat sheet. You say this is what we do, and this is a tag you use to do that. You tell people how to format notes and warnings and how to format figures. So they're not always going, oh, gee, I forgot how to do that, or reading through your code base to figure it out. And you should also publish that cheat sheet as well, typically in your repository or on your website if you're doing calls for documentation people. If you're the lucky person who's setting up the doc repo, you're going to want to spend some time looking at conf.py. So the one that installs will actually build stuff, but you are going to want to control your table of contents and your version numbers and stuff like that. So take some time. And the Sphinx documentation is very good at telling you how to set up your conf.py. So it's a matter of, this is what they say, I try it and go, oh yeah, I like that. The other thing I would suggest is also take a look at the extensions. And again, these are in the Sphinx documentation. And try them out and see if you like them. And some of them you'll find, oh, that is really useful, and some you'll say, no, we'll never use that. Okay, so I have a bunch of URLs here. So Sphinx itself and its documentation is from sphinx-doc. For those of you interested in translation software, I highly recommend Pootle. And I've given 2 examples of our own repositories if you want to go in and see how we laid it out, what our conf.py looks like. And I'll leave that up for a bit because we do have time for questions. Yes?
Does Sphinx support extracting documentation from source code or generating documentation from like function prototypes and things like that?
Yeah. So the question is, does Sphinx support extracting stuff from your source code to make documentation? And that's actually what it was created for. So if you ever have gone in and looked at the Python documentation, all of that stuff is being extracted from the Python source code. And it has several languages that it understands. So it understands C, Python, I believe Java. There's at least half a dozen languages. Yep. Yep.
Does Sphinx have any provision for formatting layout? Like, for example, the graphics are full width in line, or can you encapsulate that?
So the question is basically dealing with formatting of figures. So by default, you can change it. So you can actually hard set your dimensions, which I wouldn't recommend. So by default, it's almost like working with an SVG. It will scale to the device that is reading it. So just by not saying what size to set it, that's what it does by default, which is handy for multiple devices. Any question?
I'm curious with your experience for PC-BSD specifically, how you manage screenshots in the team.
Mm-hmm.
I know for something like PC-BSD where it's set up, like you would have a system installed that you would screenshot over time, how that was configured, or the prerequisites to get to where you could take that screenshot and change.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious how you manage keeping screenshots up to date for PC-BSD.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So we're always of the philosophy, eat your own dog food. So everybody in PC-BSD runs PC-BSD. For FreeNAS, we all have our own FreeNAS systems. I'm actually not a very good visual person. I'm more text. So on my PC-BSD system, I just use K-snapshot to grab things. One of the things that I found useful over the years was coming up early on with a numbering system, because your figures are going to change with releases. So for example, we have a tool called App Cafe. So my first App Cafe screenshot was App Cafe 1. And when that changed, it would be at Cafe 1A, 1B, 1C, and so forth. So it actually gives you an idea over time how often this screen is changed. And we have actually made it to the double letters. I think we're up to like AE for one of the screenshots. But having a useful naming convention is useful, especially if you have multiple people dealing with screenshots. There's a question in the back.
I'm using ASCII doc right now, and I am considering switching. And I'm wondering if you have any experience with it, have any contrast between ASCII doc and Sphinx.
So personally, I've not used ASCII doc. I do know there are conversion utilities. So I would take one of your docs and convert it and see what it looks like.
I would suggest checking out Pandoc.
Yep.
Pandoc does a really good job of converting from ASCII doc to just about anything back to ASCII doc. But it's just PANDOC. At least get it started.
Yep. And that one's command line and easy to use. Any question?
Sorry, I missed the beginning, but I'm curious about your whole workflow, because at my company, we have the user write the project spec up front.
Yep.
So we're using Confluence, which is an Atlassian product, and it ties to Jira, so the request becomes an issue, and then when that's completed, you'd like it to cycle back, because they already wrote how it works,
Right.
more or less, and you're just refining it.
Right.
But it's new to us, and it's not perfect, so I was just curious if that was a pipe dream of yours, or...
Well, my pipe dream is that we actually get specs. The second dream after that is that we get comments in our code.
Yeah.
But having said that, which sounds really terrible, we've been very lucky in that we have direct access to the developers. So I can ping someone on IRC and Slack and say, you need to describe to me what this is supposed to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
We've also, for both our developers and our doc people, we've always been insistent on bug reports. So if you do see something in the documentation that's wrong, most of them, I've actually trained them that if it's something small, they go, well, gee, it's in the Git repo. It's going to be easier for me to change those 6 lines in Git than to make a bug report and have you do it, which is nice. But what I've also found, especially with the QA piece, we don't really have QA, but as we're writing documentation, that's when we find a lot of bugs. So we always try to start the documentation for a release as early as the release is branched, so that we actually get that testing period as we're documenting. But that's working with a really small team.
Like what is small?
So PC-BSD, 3 devs and 1 doc person. So very small.
And no QA person?
No QA. So, but our saving grace has been CI, so we at least know instantaneously if we've broken the build. So we actually have Git triggers that on every commit it starts a build. So we know really quickly if we've broken something. Yeah, and that's for both source and docs. That was a question in the front.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I've been thinking about like the workflow as well, and like how to, not build projects and then 3 years later, like wonder how you should be editing them because you don't remember how they were built anymore.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about like workflows where, for us, we're web developers, and I was thinking like for our designers, their final delivery should not be some document that the client signs off on, gets built, and gets thrown away. The final product should be documentation. I think all team members should be contributing to documentation.
Yeah. And there are some projects that actually take the stance, we will not commit your code until we see the docs that go with it, which is one extreme. It's a really nice extreme to have. But you'll also have other projects that our release is not ready to release because the docs aren't done yet. And that's actually a nice middle ground to actually hold up a release. Yeah.
You were talking a little bit about the theming. I'm not sure how much you looked into it, but is it when you define kind of the visual style of your documentation, do you have to do it per output format, or is it kind of a common style?
Conf.py. So the nice thing about it is everything is conf.py. So the one file to rule them all. The other thing that's really cool, so conf.py is going to support if-else statements, and it also depends how you've laid out your repository. So one way to lay out your doc branches is I'll have a conf.py for every version, and it will just cover that version. What we've done in FreeNAS for a while, we also have TrueNAS, which is the customer supported one, which has some extra docs. So in one conf.py, in one code repository, I can say build FreeNAS 910, use this branding, so it sets out the layout and the logo, put the guide where it belongs in the OS itself, because we have it built in. And I can say for TrueNAS, build 9.3, put in the branding, use this different template, and I can do that all in one repository in one conf.py, which is really nice. Thanks. One more question?
Yeah. I'm going to frame this according to PC-BSD, so maybe it'll be a bit clearer. When you're doing changes, when the developers are making changes in the code from, say, current 11 current,
right.
When they're actively making changes, documentation for whatever application has been written for the previous version.
Right.
What method are you using so that the developers can let the documentation team know, we've gone in and changed some stuff on this, you might need to go back and double check the documentation to make sure it matches now? Do you have a system in place?
Yes.
Or?
So what we've done forever is all commits get emailed to everybody. So both developers can look at commits going by and say, why did you do that? That's retarded, if that's the case. And up to now, I've been the one doc person, so right now I'm training a new doc team. But because I already have our documentation in my head, I know what we have, I can look at commits and go, oh, I'm going to have to change that. Okay. So I actually have a running to-do list of commits. And I also know, because it's a commit, I know which developer did it, and I know who to bug if I don't understand what the change is. And I also can give our release engineer an idea of, I'm going to need 6 more weeks to finish these docs. And if release is in 4 weeks, we're going to have to hold it up for 2 weeks. Okay? So I think we're going to have to leave time for the next person. Also want to show this slide. So there's my contact info. There's the slide share. And I think this is how they know that it's over. And there is a, that's the review. And again, that's on a schedule as well, if you want to read it. Thank you.